Good evening. It's a privilege to welcome all of you in person and online to what will be a great program. We are honored and appreciate your support of Valley Beit Midrash. Tonight, our two speakers bridge the Jewish denominational divide. Their book and professional relationship embodies one of the tenets of VBM's mission statement: Jewish learning for all. Sorry, having trouble seeing. It is especially meaningful for me tonight to be introducing one of our guests, Abigail Pogrebin. Not sure, can I call you Abby now since we met? Okay. Not sure if it's been done before, but just 2 years ago, I introduced her mom, Letty Cotton Pogrebin, for the Hammerman Family Lecture. Abby Pogrebin graduated from Yale University and worked in broadcasting for CBS and PBS. She was president of Central Synagogue in New York City, and I know a lot of us tune in and watch Rabbi Dov, and has moderated conversations for the JCC in Manhattan, the Streicker Center, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, and the Shalom Hartman Institute. 20 years ago, I heard Abigail Pogrebin speak at the Brandeis Book and Author Luncheon here in Phoenix. It was an enlightening talk, and I enjoyed reading the deep dive into the Jewishness and Judaism of the 62 prominent Jews that she interviewed in The Star of David. This won't come as a surprise to those of you who know me, but another one of her books that I find fascinating is called Showstopper, where she documents her experience as a cast member on Broadway in Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along. In addition, Abby Pogrebin is the editor of the National Jewish Week, or is the author of the National Jewish Book Award finalist, My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew. She's written for The Atlantic, The Forward, and Tablet.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you, Rabbi Linzer, and to Temple Soldat for hosting us again. As the title of tonight's program suggests, we live in a time of deep division. While our country is divided, it is especially painful that we Jews are divided. So those of you who know me, my kids always harass me because I'm always listening to some Jewish broadcast or other. I'll go to services, I come home, I turn on more services. It's just and I don't think you can do too much learning in this lifetime. So I was tuning into a Zoominar from Moment Magazine, and who was on but Rabbi Linzer, Abby, and your mom actually. And I said, Cheryl, you gotta watch this. This is great. And then we both said, we gotta have them come out. And I'm so glad that you could join us tonight. Rabbi Dov Linzer is the president and the Rosh HaYeshiva of Chovevei Torah, which is a school that's especially close to Valley Beit Midrash. Our founder, Darren Kleinberg, graduated from there, was ordained from there. And of course, our leader, Rabbi Yanklowitz, is from there. And we have a very special affinity and a special relationship with that school because they really teach Judaism, and they really turn out some terrific rabbis, as we all know. Rabbi Linzer has been an innovative leader in the Orthodox community. He originated the Linzer two-ring ceremony, where the husband and wife exchange rings at the wedding ceremony. This is a practice that is not often done in Orthodox at Orthodox weddings, and he really got that going more, and it's even named after him. He also supported the naming of Dina Nachman as the spiritual leader of Yeshivat Eliezer. And I think I noticed that she has joined us online tonight, so welcome, Rabbi. So glad to see you here. These are major changes, and they're the kind of things that bring the community together, and that's something that's a goal I think that all of us have. Rabbi Linzer has a BA in philosophy from the University of Maryland. Smicha was granted from the Israeli Rabbinic, and he has also studied at Columbia. He's been published extensively, and he has been a scholar in residence throughout the world. Cheryl and I are honored to bring these two outstanding leaders to our community.
Hi, Zoom friends, and we see you on Zoom. Oh, beautiful people on Zoom. And we will hear your questions as well. We will make sure. Hi, Barbara, Mark Dreyfus. Hi, Steve Chauvin. So many others. Yes, everybody knows you here. So, oh, Judy Gottschalk. Hi, Judy Gottschalk. Okay, yep. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. So this is really delightful to be in this conversation. Can you see? Oh, no, Abby, you're not in. We got to get you in. I'm sorry, we got to squeeze in together. No, well, I'm going to pass it around. So, thanks, Carrie. This is the wonderful Carrie Bernstein. So it takes two to Torah. An Orthodox rabbi and Reformed journalist discuss and debate their way through the 5 books of Moses. If you don't have this book already, it's for sale here, and they will sign it at dessert tonight. So I hope you will pick it up. It's a delightful way to learn Torah in dialogue. Let's hear a little bit from them tonight. Well, to start, this is a little bit of an odd partnership to start learning together. This is not just an Orthodox rabbi, he's a Rosh HaYeshiva of a rabbinical school. And it's not normal to engage in a chavruta with someone of the opposite gender, so unless it may be maybe your wife or your daughter. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how this came about and how this started for you.
First of all, it's great to be with you all. I also enjoyed the burgers. I want to thank the Hammermans for making it possible and for welcoming my mother, who had such a good time here that she said you'd be lucky if you ever get invited out. And Shmuly has been I am a little bit of a rabbi groupie, and he is one of these, stars, as you know, in the firmament, that as a journalist in the Jewish world, he's always my first call when I'm writing any series or any article, and he's usually too busy to talk to me. He's always wonderful, and it turns me down because he's saving the world. I need him, but it's just such an honor to be here. I would just say that I have to sort of back up a little bit to the Jewish bio for those who don't know me, because it will kind of make it a little more clear why our friendship is a little unlikely. But basically on one foot, I was raised by Letty Cotton Pogrebin and Bert. My dad is a sort of shorter Jewish bio. He was raised in Roosevelt, New Jersey. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. It was a WPA project in the New Deal, a little town near Hightstown, Princeton. And he basically was the bagel Jew that we hear about, where it was very much social justice oriented, a lot of labor songs, not a lot of Torah and learning. And then he married my mom, who was raised as a very conservative, observant Jew in Jamaica, Queens. And she had, as some of you may know from her book, Deborah Golda and Me, she writes about this. She had a seminal experience when she was 15, despite years of deep Jewish learning, which was unlikely for a girl in her 50s. She was an unusual bat mitzvah for her time. She was not allowed to say Kaddish for her mother when her mother died of cancer very suddenly and painfully. And just the fact that essentially Judaism was not something, was sort of turning its back at a time she needed it, even though she understood the rules, was very disillusioning for her. She left Jewish practice for a long time, and she came back to it very strongly later, I can attest. But my twin sister Robin and my brother and I kind of fell through the proverbial cracks. We didn't get a formal Jewish education. We did celebrate Hanukkah and Shabbat, and we were sort of shul surfing on the high holidays, but I didn't grow up with a sense of a Jewish community or a Jewish home outside my own. And I will just say as a note, when I was interviewing, is it Cheryl? Was saying that Stars of David, I interviewed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she described exactly the same story. I had thought that it was just my mother's experience, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mother died when she was 17. She was also not allowed to say Kaddish for her mother. She also left Judaism for a while because of it. It turns out it was sort of a generational moment, as some of you may know. But I began to kind of be bothered by why I didn't, what I didn't know. And when I went to Yale, I took Jewish literature. I don't know if you remember Harold Bloom, who's not around anymore. I took Hebrew. And when I had my first child, it was really that awakening that many have of what am I passing on? How could I explain it? I started to study Torah. I became totally obsessed with Jewish learning. I am just like you. I am like any minute that I have, I'm absorbing and reading and listening to podcasts, and now that you can shul surf online, I'm listening to other sermons. I became a bat mitzvah at age 40, and really just, it became the journalism that I did. So fast forward, I get invited to this Jewish conference, because when you write Jewish books, you get invited to conferences. And there was Dov Linzer, who in my kind of, paying attention to the people who really make me think and kind of make my sort of like synapses start to fire. He was that Orthodox rabbi who suddenly could talk about things that I'd never heard an Orthodox rabbi sort of brave in terms of material. In terms of subject matter and kind of courage of being willing to open up some of the things that I think were I thought were very closed. And he could talk about what open Orthodoxy is, or his sort of brand or lane of Orthodoxy. But we struck up a friendship just because we argued and discussed and shared ideas. And I'll just finish by saying that when I was working on my second book in the Jewish space, which was the deep dive into the Jewish holidays called My Jewish Year, I interviewed over 60 rabbis and scholars for the book. And at the very end of it, I needed to kind of kick the tires on the Judaism and make sure that the rabbis sitting here, for instance, we're not going to say, you got that wrong and that's not exactly accurate. And so it became this havruta over months of just talking through every detail that was posited in the book. And it was so generous of him. It was a testament to how kind of Dov moves through the world. I hear he's a pretty merciless teacher, but he was very generous to me. And that started this unlikely friendship.
So I'll also give a sense of where I come from, so you can really see how we're coming from two different places and sort of where we met in the arc of our lives. So I grew up in a modern Orthodox community, actually in Silver Spring, Maryland. People can hear me, yes? Yes, okay. I grew up, even though it was a modern Orthodox high school, the teachers there were more from the right-wing yeshivish world. And the message that I got as a young man was that already in high school was that the most important thing that a Jewish boy, and it was very specifically a boy or a Jewish man, can do with their lives is to spend their lives studying Torah and to learn all of Torah. And I really internalized this message somehow more than my other classmates, and really devoted all of my time to that. Also, the learning, particularly the learning of Talmud, which was the most engrossing, was something that spoke to me, the intellectual excitement of the arguments. I really took to it. So already at a young age, in my teens, I was spending 4 to 6 hours a day studying Talmud, and just myself in front of, a page of Talmud, maybe with a chavruta study partner. And I was so immersed in it that even after I was walking home, from school, I would be reviewing all of the arguments in my head and what proof did this rabbi bring and what proof did that rabbi bring and how do you explain this? How do you explain that? So in order to really concentrate, I would be closing my eyes to really focus, as I'm reviewing in my head, and inevitably I would walk into a telephone pole multiple times. This is, it's true, but it's also a powerful, I think, metaphor about that stage of my life, because it was intense, it was deep, immersive, but it was with blinders on. What allowed me to have that focus was that no peripheral vision. I was not seeing the world around me. That continued for a number of years. I went to Israel. I studied at the Gush. People might know that, an elite Hesder Yeshiva in Israel. At that stage, it was 14 to 16 hours a day studying the Talmud. And that was the most intensive time, I would say, of my life, but by shutting everything out. Jump forward maybe 20 years after that, and I was heading a Kollel in Boca Raton, Florida, and Rabbi Avi Weiss, a name I think probably is known to all of you, who's a great a leader, considers himself an Orthodox rabbi for the Jewish community, not just the Orthodox community, an activist on behalf of Am Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. At that stage, he said we needed to start a different type of a rabbinical school that would stand for a different type of an orthodoxy that people would not experience, well, for example, what Abby's mother experienced growing up, that there would be a greater place for women within the Orthodox community and in the synagogue, that it would be committed to building bridges with the other denominations, cared for all of Am Yisrael, not building walls, which sadly so much of the Orthodox community had been invested in. A type to create communities that everybody had a place, that we would be intellectually open. This was the Orthodoxy that he believed in, and he said we had to create rabbis that represented this and would go out and bring it to the Orthodox community and to the larger world. And he came to me and he said he wanted me to be the Rosh HaYeshiva. He was the president. It was just starting. It hadn't started yet. And I was to be the person who would head the sort of represent the scholarship of the institution, be the main teacher of the institution. And at that stage in my life, my field of vision had widened somewhat, and that really spoke to me. And I decided to join him on what has now been an amazing adventure. We are now 25 years later, and we have 150 rabbis out in the field in the States, 50 rabbis and Rabbinic Head in Israel. We've been so successful. And as I said earlier today, for those who were here for dinner, Rabbi Yanklowitz, without embarrassing him, is like, I would say, the example of the rabbi that all of our rabbis aspire to be, and really a shining example of what our institution is out to do and what we have created. So that was what I was doing for 20 years as the Rosh HaYeshiva. And even though our rabbis were amazingly talented, as you can see in Rabbi Shmuly, of taking the depth of the tradition of the Torah and bringing it to people's lives, bringing it to the urgent issues of the world, I, in terms of myself and my own teaching, had not expanded that much because I was still teaching rabbinical students. I still hadn't left the walls of the institution, and figuratively. And then 5 years ago, I became not only the Rosh HaYeshiva, but Rabbi Weiss had stepped back and also the president of Chovevei Torah. And at that stage, I realized that I had to be now doing the work that our rabbis were doing. I had to be representing the yeshiva to the larger community and speaking a Torah that spoke to, all of Am Yisrael and spoke to the issues of the world. And I turned to Abby and I said, Abby, we have had such an amazing chavruta, partnership over the years, talking about Torah issues in the Jewish community, God, everything under the sun. Let's bring this conversation to the broader community, and let's do it in the context of learning Parsha together. And that began a podcast called Parsha in Progress, which was hosted by Tablet Magazine. We did it every other week, so every other Parsha. So over the course of 2 years, we covered the entire Torah. And each week, we did not do everything in the Parsha. We decided to focus on one issue that was really relevant. And we did 10 minutes, focused 10 minutes each week. And that was the project that we did. Then people really, really loved it. And at the end of 2 years, we were done with the podcast. And then Abby, why don't you tell us how it became a book?
It became a book.
And the book reads as your true voices so brilliantly. I mean, to take a podcast and turn it into a book is not an easy. Is it still working? Okay, it's not a super easy thing, and it really reads as their voices. And to take one of the most top-rate best of journalists and interviewers and writers, and one of the most brilliant and sensitive Rosh HaYeshiva in the world, and put them together in dialogue is not a common thing. So yeah, it would be wonderful to hear why you thought this was important. It's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to go learn Torah with my community who thinks just like me. We have the same values. But to say we're coming from different worlds, but we want to talk Torah together. Why did you think that was important?
I would say that I was a little hesitant at first. And part of it is that I have full and total humility about how behind the 8 ball I am on this kind of pursuit, and the fact that this is Dov's bread and butter and Shmuly's, and they do this all the time. And particularly Dov has taught it for his entire life, and he didn't even tell you the anecdote about how he didn't even want to get up from his learning in Israel, so he literally chewed coffee grounds just to stay awake. I mean, that's how intense his learning has been. And I am not catching up in the sense that I always feel inadequate, because obviously I'm inadequate to the whole point of Judaism is that we're inadequate, that the mastery is never possible. But I felt like if this was a completely imbalanced exercise, there would be sort of no fruit in it. And I was saying that not like, oh, tell me I'm great, but more like, are you sure I have something to bring? And that's where Dov again was saying, I don't want to just sort of be in conversation with people who are agreeing with me or coming from what I'm coming from. I actually want to be asked the questions, and I want to ask you the questions because we are so different. And that's really what was, what is on the page and what was in the podcast is a very real-time discourse and disputation that we had, where, first of all, I felt invited to be honest about where I was stuck, to be honest about where the barriers were, to be honest about when I was moved. And sometimes I think I get a little more moved than Dov. He's less emotional. He's kind of over it. But there were so many times where I just, I saw a verse and it was kind of like my life in the moment, whether it was someone in my life who was sick, whether it was the fact that the travel ban was going on, whether it was the post-George Floyd reckoning that was happening, or the pandemic. I mean, my God, Tazria is suddenly like, how did they know that this is going to happen? You know, it used to be, you know, the albatross of the parsha to put on a child was to give them Tazria, and suddenly it was literally like living in our day. These questions about who do we expel from the tent, and when can we allow someone back, and the idea of contagion, the idea of impurity. That's one example of thousands of where Torah was speaking to the moment. I mean, we all know it, but just to be doing this with him in real time, with the discipline of, you know, every week and the preparation that we did to prepare. So I was kind of convinced in the doing, I would say. And particularly, as the Hammerman said, this is a time when people are not listening to each other. And if they do, they say, let me listen to you so that I can then tell you how you're wrong. But to really say, maybe you're going to change my mind here. Maybe I haven't thought differently. That was just an extraordinary exercise.
Beautiful. Why was this important for you?
Oh, well, I mean, as I said, I think that I, for many years, was living through my students and the way they were able to broaden the Torah and, you know, bring the Torah to people's lives. And I had come to realize, particularly taking on the position as president, pushed me, I think, to really, you know, grapple with the fact that even though I've been spending all of my life not only learning, but learning in Chavruta, and Chavruta model, it's all supposed to be about finding the greater truth. You have somebody sitting opposite you at, you know, across the table, and you're arguing back and forth about the meaning of a text, and you're open to questions, and you're allowing yourself to be challenged. I mean, that's really what's so missing from larger society, that open debate and dialogue. So I thought, okay, great, that's been my life, seeking the truth. But I came to realize that the person sitting across from me has always been somebody who shared 99.9% of my worldview, my values, my commitments. So the types of questions that were raised were really from a very narrow range. And I really was not allowing myself to be challenged in a broader way. And Abby is just such an amazing reporter, journalist, interviewer. So, I mean, she didn't say that at that conference, you know, what she was enjoying what I was saying, but every time I would say something, she would tell me how brilliant it was. So, I mean, how could I turn away from that? But she has this way of like really listening to what you're saying, really being interested in it, but then following up with such a, you know, perceptive, incisive question. But what about this? But how do you understand that in a way that it, rather than making me defensive, opened me up to thinking in completely new ways. And I really wanted that type of broadening and that new type of a chavruta to continue. I will say that what happened in the course of it was not only this broadening of the chavruta, this type of a chavruta, but for so much of my life, Torah had been really only in conversation with Torah. Meaning in the yeshiva, you learn a page of Talmud or a piece of Talmud. Oh, this is so interesting because of how it relates to that other piece of Talmud that I learned. And this chavruta actually created a new chavruta for the Torah. The Torah was now in chavruta with the world. And that was really such a transformative experience.
Beautiful. So, you know, I think that just as we talk about polarization in America, we talk about it in the Jewish community. It's not rare we would hear, you know, among some, why would I learn with someone Orthodox? They're so close-minded. Or why would I learn with someone Reform? It's such a watered-down Torah. You know, but that really see a value in learning together and from each other in a deep way. People would say this is the best living manifestation of what pluralism is. Is this how you think of it? Was one of your goals to engage in something pluralistic, or would you think of it in different terms?
That's
I mean, I feel like until we did this, I really didn't understand pluralism, you know, in a funny way. And when I was president of Central Synagogue, you know, it's a very large place. There's 6,000 members now, and as crazy as it is, a waiting list of 800 families. And so there's so much of focus on just how to get more people in, you know, like how do we absorb more people? And the challenge is often like we can't meet life cycle demands and we can't fit everybody in on the high holidays. I mean, these are the problems, but they're such sort of insular problems. Like how do we get more of us into this thing that is, we're all very alike. And I love my community. I mean, it's my Jewish home. But, you know, I look around and I sort of feel like it's, you know, it's that small circle, even in New York City, that doesn't really kind of push you at all. So this was, I mean, you know, I realized kind of not how radioactive this was, but how unusual this was. Partly when we started to travel, and when this book came out, not so much when the podcast was happening, but now that we're out in the world, there's just a little more kind of friction. I don't know what the word is. Some people being like, wait a second, how did this work? And how do you travel together? And what do you mean, you're a Reform Jew? And, I'm not one of these people who's defensive about Reform Judaism because I didn't grow up as a Reform Jew. I found a synagogue that happens to be Reform, and I feel very strongly about Central, but it's not like I was raised with sort of the Reform Jewish narrative in the water. That's different for Dov. Like, I think he is so oriented towards his lane of Judaism. And so I feel like I've sort of learned in a way how many times the walls come down. And the last thing I will just say is when
Wait, just to clarify, the walls
yeah.
come down between us?
No, the
Okay.
walls come down, in your world.
Oh.
Just saying quickly that they asked me to put a Hanukkah panel together after my book came out to kind of do Hanukkah reignited, and we're going to invite whoever you want. And so we were going to talk about the holiday through, kind of all different kinds of lenses. So it was Amichai Lau-Levi, some of you may know, he started Lab Shul, and it was Bert Visotsky, who is a Midrash expert at JTS. And it was Bruce Feiler, who wrote Walking the Bible, Sarah Hurwitz, who was the first ever woman to be ordained in Orthodoxy by Avi Weiss, and Jill Hammer, who I don't know how you describe. She's kind of like a shaman or something. And I invited someone from Chabad. And I know the guy at Chabad because I've dealt with him. He's a PR guy. His name is Moti Sellerson. And he just kept ducking my emails. This sounds wonderful. Sounds like a great event. Let me get back to you. You can imagine where this is going. Like just circling, and then also Avi Shafran, who's someone I had interviewed before, could not be more right-wing. He is the spokesman for Aguda Israel, and he also said, really interesting, let me get back to you. And he finally wrote to me and said, Abby, I would be sanctioning, essentially koshering the idea of a non-Orthodox rabbi on that stage if I sat next to them. And I'm not going to do that, and Chabad's not going to do that. And it was just one of those times, you can hear the judgment in my voice, but I also had to realize there are just certain red lines. And so it's just a long way of saying this was more both refreshing and in a way heretical than I expected.
Yeah. So I don't think I was ever motivated by a sense of, oh, let's do something pluralistic. I always meant pluralism to me always was a stance of appreciating that everybody is contributing and recognizing the value in everybody's different position and orientation and belief system. But I was just motivated by curiosity and a desire to grow and a desire to learn more that was coming out of our conversations. And, I think it is unusual, sadly, within Orthodoxy, maybe particularly for Orthodox rabbis, to follow that impulse and desire without worrying about all the categories, but I follow the teaching of Maimonides, who says, he's quoting someone else, nobody knows the original author of this statement, but the Hebrew is kabel et ha'emet mimi she'amro, accept the truth from whoever says it. Don't worry about who's saying it. Like you should be, engaging in arguments and ideas to find the ultimate truth. And that's really what propelled me. I will say, that just last night, I got an email from an event we had done we had done an event at a conservative synagogue outside of San Francisco. And somebody wrote me an email and said, I'm not a member of the synagogue, but my wife is. I was at the event. And I want you to know that I do not agree with your version of Orthodoxy, and I don't think it is legitimate to be talking Torah with somebody who does not accept the divinity of Torah. And I felt like that is just so sad, like the sense that you're going to cut off yourself from people, conversations. It wasn't even legitimating. It was just like, you can't have those conversations. So I think for me, it was always just this desire to engage, to be open, to learn. But I do want to say something in terms of what it has meant for me in terms of pluralism, because the more, as Abby was saying, than the project of the podcast for the book tour has taken us We've been to so many cities, I don't know, by now it feels like about 20, and maybe 20 cities and 30 different locations, and a lot of conservative and reform synagogues. I've been to more conservative and reform synagogues in the last 2 months than I've been at the last 58 years of my life. And I actually shared with the students, with our rabbinical students, about how my thinking about the other rabbis and other denominations has shifted, not so much in terms of how I think differently, but how I feel differently. Because I always have felt that, as I said, there are great rabbis out there, different denominations, everybody's doing their part of serving God and serving the Jewish community, but it was all very intellectual. And when I started going to all of these synagogues and meeting these rabbis, and they would, men and women, and they would moderate and interview us, and I could even see in the small moments of the moderating their amazing, way of bringing the rabbinic voice, the depth of Torah, the type of support, insight, and it went from my head to my kishkas. I really felt what it was that everybody is doing here in terms of serving Am Yisrael. So that has been very transformative.
So one of the things that was so startling for me when I went from the libraries of universities to the yeshiva world was in the universities, I sat alone in libraries with books. And when I entered the yeshiva world, people were screaming at each other and arguing and standing up while they're doing it, like the opposite of a library. And I love both. I love the quiet book reading, but I also love the Jewish argumentation. I think it's a great gift we have for the world of how to argue and then hug, right? I think American culture at large doesn't understand that. Like, you argue, so I'm not your friend anymore. And Jews, we argue, then we go have a l'chaim, And so, of course, it's not all kumbaya. You didn't just agree on everything. You had many disagreements. So let's explore some of your disagreements. Let's start with Ruvain. Ruvain. Was Ruvain courageous? Was he inexcusably wrong? How do you think about Ruvain? And what was that conversation like for you? You want to give the context first?
I'll give the context. It's actually a perfect place to start because it's this week's parsha. So,
of course it was. Yeah.
So, Joseph has been telling his brothers obliviously about, his dreams and getting their hatred and enmity and jealousy stirred up. And the brothers are off now. 10 of the brothers are watching the sheep, shepherding the sheep. And Jacob, his father, sends Joseph to look after the welfare of the brothers. And so he goes and he's on his way there. They see him coming. And then the Bible says, the Torah says, they said one to his brother, "Oh, look here, this dreamer is coming. Let's kill him. We'll say a wild animal ate him. Then let's see what will be with his dreams." And then the verse says, and Ruvain rose up and saved him from their hands and said, "Let us not commit murder. Let's throw him into one of these pits and we'll say that an animal has eaten him." And then the verse says, in order to return him to his father. That was his plan, right? To say that's the initial move. And then somehow Ruvain goes off scene. We don't know what happened to him. And the next we're hearing these caravan of Ishmaelites or Midianites are passing by. They sell Joseph. He gets brought down to Egypt. And then all of a sudden, it's like you can imagine it on a stage, right? He comes back off from being off stage. Ruvain returns and says, "Where's Joseph?" And then he rents his garments because now Joseph is no longer there to return him to his father. So why don't you pick up that?
Thank you, Dov. I do not think he's courageous. I felt like he fell short. I felt like the fact that he went wherever he went, and if he meant to save him, didn't do a very good job, and that he kind of allowed something nefarious to unfold. It felt like, and Dov can speak for himself, he was sort of defending a half measure. And when I think about the moral of the story, I would want my kids to do more and to risk maybe their own safety a little bit more, to stand by a brother who was really in trouble and who you couldn't guarantee was going to live, even though the verse says that he intended to return him to his father. Take it away, Dov.
So I think we can agree that what he did was a half measure. Like, he shouldn't have left him. He should have returned him to the father. I think the question is, what message do we want to come away with from the story? How do we want to tell that story, right? Do we want to say, look at how bad this was. Ruvain didn't do what he needed to. He did not follow through. That's true. But what I would rather say is, look at what he at least did. that he was willing to stand up to 9 of his brothers who were out for blood and to convince them to not kill him, at least not immediately. And we're living in a world where there's too much people being bystanders and enablers and not even willing to do anything. So I would like to more sort of celebrate or be aware that he fell short. And I think part of the problem with Reuven always is that he's impetuous and he never has a full plan and strategy and follow through. He just acts on the moment. But I'd rather to at least say, thank God, at least he stood up. If he had not done that, who knows what would have happened. So
What do you think, Rabbi Shmuly?
Oh, I'm not gonna put my view into that one. Yeah. I'm right in the middle of you both on that one. So, but let's fast forward to Parshat Naso, Sota. One of you can remind us what the Sota episode is about, and how do you both experience the case of the Sota differently?
Okay. So to me, this is one of the most, I'll just start by just saying there are one of the eurekas for me of working with Dov or talking with Dov is that I realize on a very serious note that because this text is divine for him, he has to kind of reconcile it to be positive in almost every case. And sometimes I would see him kind of what I call pretzeling himself to get to the better outcome. And this is a perfect example. And I respect that. I respect the idea. I do think it's a sacred document, but I don't feel commanded by it the way he does, obligated to it the way he does. And for this story, which is basically that a husband who has any suspicion that his wife is cheating can bring her before the priests, and she's basically humiliated. They tousle her hair, which is obviously degrading, and they read these curses that will befall her if she's guilty, and they scrape the curses of the ink into water and like stir it with dirt, and she has to drink it. And then if her belly distends, she's guilty. And meanwhile, her thighs fall, which for someone in my age, is very real. And just the idea that there was no justice, and this was completely at the whim of her husband. And I didn't see any possible, what do you call it? Silver lining.
redeeming quality.
Redeeming quality. Thank you, Dov. Go ahead and redeem this story.
I'll do my best. So as Abby said, I do come to the text with a belief that it is from God and that God is good. And therefore, I don't think every character has to be good. I think Reuven did half measures. I think even our forefathers and foremothers are flawed individuals. That's what makes their story so compelling. But I think that the mitzvot in the Torah, what God commands, how God acts in the Torah, I have to try to understand that that is good. And I think that I am probably, again, different from most Orthodox Jews and certainly Orthodox rabbis in that I am at least willing to acknowledge when and challenge myself when it seems that it is not good, when it seems that a mitzvah is not consistent with what I would think is basic questions of morality and right and wrong. And this is, of course, one of these cases. And the way that I have try to reconcile myself with this uses an approach of Maimonides, of Rambam. Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed, he's dealing with the case of sacrifices. He was a rationalist. He couldn't understand how God would really want animal sacrifices. But I'm going to translate it to a case of slavery, which I think is also very understandable, and it's an ethical issue, moral issue. He says, the Torah was given for all times, but it was also given to a particular people at a particular time. And people might not have been ready or weren't ready to hear certain things and to hear the ultimate good that God wanted from them. And it would have, and therefore, sometimes the Torah starts people on a path and it doesn't spell out the end of the path. And it's because that's how you get started. So in the case of slavery, the Torah, I think it's clear, does not like slavery. We were slaves in the land of Egypt. It has many mitzvot to make that institution better. Free your slaves after 7 years. If a master kills a slave, the master is put to death. That is completely revolutionary and radical in the Torah. But what the Torah never said is, you shall not own slaves. This is a horrific institution. It should be eradicated. And the reason is because because it would have been completely ignored. It would not have led us to any progress. It took us 3,000 years from the time the Torah was given to get rid of slavery. Only 150 years ago in America did the Western world finally, get rid of slavery. And in some ways, as Rabbi Shmuly knows, it's still very much still alive. So the Torah will start us on a path because that's how you get started. So I try to use that, what I'll call strategy here, and say that in a case where you have a husband, a society that is patriarchal, and the husband has this type of unilateral prerogative and right to get his wife executed for suspicions of adultery, the Torah should ideally change that whole society. But in the interim, it's saying, let's get them to reconcile and and to put the husband's suspicions at rest. So it sets up a test, and this test is made so that what the Torah says is, if she is guilty, these things will happen. Her stomach will distend, her thighs will fall. If she's innocent, nothing will happen. Well, you know what? When you drink inky, muddy water, nothing is going to happen. It'll taste disgusting, but nothing is going to happen. Short of divine punishment, divine intervention of punishment, nothing is going to happen, and she's going to pass the
So
test.
reassuring.
So that is how I would like to understand. And I do want to say, because Rabbi Shmuly quoted Rambam earlier today for those who were at dinner, and Maimonides quoted a line from the Talmud that says, in order to make peace between husband and wife, God allowed God's name to be erased into the water. And that was actually referring to this ritual. So the rabbis also, they try to say, the goal here is to get them to reconcile and to create peace. Now, it's at the expense of degrading the woman, debasing the woman. But, I try. Well, right. So Abby, of course, held up a mirror to me and said, Dov, you think you've solved that in your mind, and I appreciate what you're trying to do. But if you're being honest and looking at it from the outside, it's still pretty ugly, and you still haven't solved it.
Beautiful. So let's talk about your disagreement about the end of Moses's life. The Talmud says that the first act of kindness in the Torah is God clothes Adam and Eve. And the last act of kindness in the Torah is God buries Moshe. And one of the things I love about that we don't know when Moshe is buried, I mean, we kind of know, but we don't specifically know, is I sometimes wonder, with all respect to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if he takes up too much space in the civil rights discourse. Moshe, we don't care about Moshe in the Haggadah so much in Pesach. Right? We don't want to go visit where he's buried. It's not about him. It's about a people. It's about a redemption. It's not about this one man. And yet there seems to be some injustice that Moshe can't go into Israel after all this. So I recall you had a disagreement in looking at this passage, and I'll read this verse here. But God's in Chukat Bamidbar, Numbers. God said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I've given them. So who would like to start on this? Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
I just felt, I knew this, but reading the Torah through with Dov, it just suddenly was kind of in high relief that Moshe didn't want the job in the first place. God calls upon him, says, you're going to do this. Moses says, I'm not the guy, pick somebody else. God says, you're going to do this, and here I'm going to give you Aaron. Aaron's going to help you. And then he leads the people who could not fetch more and be more difficult, after he delivers them, and they don't like the food, and they don't like the desert, and they think that Egypt might have been better. And they build a golden calf, so they don't even trust that he's coming back when he goes up in the mountain. It's kind of thankless every step of the way. Then there's, Korach and that rebellion. He weathers all of that. He defends them multiple times when God was like, I'm done with these people. And he said, give them another chance. And what is the reward? He doesn't even get to taste it. He doesn't even get to touch it. I just felt like, why? I understand we need new leaders for new times, but it just, as I looked at the arc of it, it just felt just unfair, unjust to me. And again, when I'm sort of looking for the moral of the story, I didn't understand why that was denied to him. The one thing I'll just finish with is, you mentioned MLK Jr. I grew up with my dad playing that section of his speech over and over again. My father loved it. It was like his Torah. And it chills me every time to hear those words and to really read that piece and hear, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. It's just, particularly in these times that we're living in, it just felt like we are seeing that so often of, you know, this idea of, I'm never gonna be able to taste the thing I fought for.
So it was really helpful for me that Abby was bringing this really profound sense of injustice for Moses the person, because, you know, Moses always has been a much larger than life figure for me. In the traditional Orthodox, you know, Talmudic discourse, Moses is a bigger figure than God. Okay, it is Moses' Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher. He is this dominant figure. It's like the whole religion is more, it seems, it's his. That is certainly the rabbinic sort of take. So to really feel for Moses the person and the injustice was that was an important corrective for me. The way I understood what was happening is that when God sort of, it seems absurd, what, they hit a rock and that's why after all you sacrificed for not going into the land. So my understanding of that is that it wasn't a punishment and it wasn't a sin. What it was is an indication why he was not the right leader, because to continue into the land. 40 years ago, God had said, hit the rock, and he hit it. Now God said, speak to the rock, and he's still hitting it. He's still stuck in the old ways. And more than just a repetition, it's a type of leadership. You know, for people who were enslaved, you need to be sometimes hitting them over the head. You need like a top-down leadership, that's what Moses represented. For a people born free and who want to now go into the land and set up a country and a government and autonomy, you do not want a type of, you know, heavy-handed top-down leader that Moses represented. You need somebody who's going to talk to the people, not hit them over the head. And so what the Torah is saying is, Moses, it's your time to step aside. There needs to be new leaders. But again, what Abby was saying is, okay, but we have to hold that together with the injustice. We can't forget the injustice.
Beautiful. So you both just talked about leadership, and many people here in the room assume many positions of leadership here in the community. And when you started this conversation, you were just completing, I believe, your term as president of the synagogue and are in many other leadership roles as well. And you were just entering into your presidency at the rabbinical school and at the yeshiva at large. And I wonder how some of your learning together gave you any insights on how to lead.
Well, maybe I'll start with this one. So I'm remembering an exchange we had right at the end of the Torah, at the end of Deuteronomy, where in the parsha of Shoftim, Judges, where it's a lot about positions of authority, the Torah says that if there's a king, that he should write a Torah scroll and it should be with him all the days of his life. And when we were discussing that, Abby said, I so love this section because it's talking about being a lifelong learner. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, it's right there, you know, so he shall read it all the days of his life. And I was like, I always was focusing on the end of the verse, which said, in order to fear the Lord his God. You know, the message that no man is above the law. Even if you're the king, you're still under God's law. But what I had missed was that the way in which it is done is by the humility and the openness that comes to always understanding that you need to learn more, and there's more to learn. And you know, I have been a lifelong learner, and I am a lifelong learner, and this was part of it. But it was such a perfect example that I'm always still learning. And when you open yourself, and I think that what made, you know, the blessing of that made my leadership as becoming president, I think what has made it successful was that I entered into the position, not trained for the job. I mean, I've been a scholar all my life, and now here I was cast into this role of being president. So I really didn't know what I was doing, and I knew I needed help. And I think that's what my leadership has been. It's been, sometimes leaders feel like, oh, to show that I'm an authority, I have to have all the answers. And my approach was, I have to be asking the questions.
Very nice.
That's great. I mean, I would just start with gratitude, because I feel like one of the threads through this whole book, which I'm sure you will feel or have seen too, is this idea that we're constantly having to sort of start by paying back. And even like the minute we get in, the minute we get into the land, we have to give harvest or offerings. And that also that the language of you did not build this. You did not build this. And I think that was my real revelation as president, was how many people were going through the most acute moments of their lives all the time. And obviously when you have this many congregants, someone's always losing someone. Someone's always discovering they have painful, terrifying diagnosis. Someone's always getting divorced. Someone's always about to have a bar bat mitzvah, and it's the biggest day of their lives, or going to be under the chuppah, all baby namings, all of those sort of peak moments. Just in my role, I suddenly had a front row seat on just how much kind of, not just emotion there was, but just how Judaism was showing up for all of it. And that was really the takeaway of my leadership, was just the incredible kind of, you know, if anyone ever says kind of like, why do we still need rabbis, or why do we still need synagogues, or why do we still need ritual? You know, I saw it every day. And that was sort of how I oriented my leadership, was to just kind of be the sort of tether between the clergy, who was, you know, overtaxed by too many needs, and then these people, and sort of knowing, being able to say, I see what's happening with you, and we're all here for it.
Let's talk about post October 7th Jewish community as it emerges from your learning together. Why should we care to remember the Exodus? And Abby, as you had said, to remember that we suffered. And Rav Linzer, as you had said, to remember that we were freed. And but then you ultimately didn't disagree. You agreed in the value of each other's view on that. I wonder how those two views might inform some of our post-October 7th world.
Well, I just have to say, because Abby, in multiple places in the book, points out my limited range of cultural references, but I don't know if anybody knows this, and this is going to shock you that I know this, but my crazy ex-girlfriend song, Remember That We Suffered. Who here knows what I'm talking about? Anyone? Okay, two people, all right. We'll have to Google search that afterwards, but anyway,
Dov was at the cutting edge of the zeitgeist.
I'll let Abby start with the serious answer.
I mean, the serious answer is this has been such a difficult reckoning for me post October 7th in terms, and this is so hard to say next to someone who has done so much for the non-Jew. I have to just say that, Shmuly, as much as you do for the Jewish people. And it's as Jewish as it gets, what you do. But I see my community, and I will speak personally, feeling much more tribal and much more challenged in our empathy post October 7th because of the lack of empathy coming back. And it's not that it's a reciprocal agreement, but I go to Mishpatim and the idea of who is a stranger. And I was raised, this is just one of my early disputes, where I said to him, you know, my entire Seder was oriented towards, you should welcome, love the stranger because you were the stranger. And this idea of what we owe, this idea of that because we suffer, we should make sure no one else suffers. That was just the complete ethos of my Seder and my Haggadah. And Dov said, that's very nice, Abby, but that's nowhere in the Haggadah. He said the chief core line is, in every generation, our enemy rises up to destroy us.
And God saves us.
And God saves us. And that was just such a big, I mean, I can joke about it, but such a big kind of tectonic shift for me of really, like this is a holiday that is a warning every time of like, they're coming for us again, and don't get complacent. They're around the corner. It will return, this evil. And then we live through it. We see it. We're all living through this history. It's a cliche now. We're living through history. And so just all of sort of the Jewish pen, it's not just tikkun olam, because I believe in that phrase, but I know it's been watered down, to use your word, or overused. And I really mean this, not just to give kavod to Shmuly. When I watch him from afar, what he's doing, I just keep asking myself, because I do my work outside the Jewish community, how can I stay oriented towards the other, even if people are calling us an apartheid, genocidal, colonialist enterprise? Like, how do I just hold on to this? And it's just, so it's kind of my Jewish therapy sitting up here. But part of where I challenge Dov sometimes is like, what are you doing for the non-Jew? And is that part of your orientation in your kind of daily, you know, generosity, tzedakah, your kind of rabbinic, your Judaism? And I just feel like this moment has just made it a tougher conversation between the particularist and the universal.
So, you know, I find myself in an interesting position based on sort of the spaces that I'm in, because when I'm in Orthodox spaces, I am often talking exactly about counterbalancing that internal look and that particularist look the sense that it's all just about protecting our own. And I say, look, the Torah speaks about love the stranger, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And, when I told Abby that the traditional rabbinic reading of that is that the stranger is the convert. And I said, wait, what are you talking about? Like, it's still about our own? And I said, yeah, that is how the rabbis read it, because, they were living under oppression. They were not in a position to be have the magnanimous, luxury of caring about the other. Their whole focus was about protecting those among us. So and it depends what space I'm in. So when I'm in a Orthodox space, I remind people about what the verse is really saying, care for the other, care for the stranger. But when Abby and I were learning, it was important for me to raise the other part of it, that, the importance about how necessary it is also to be thinking about our responsibility towards our own. That being said, I will acknowledge that what Abby said is correct. While so many of our rabbis are out there serving not only broader Am Yisrael, but again, Shmuly, I know we're embarrassing you, but such a shining example of what it means to also understand our responsibility as Jews towards the larger world. My own, world had been very proscribed. It was the walls of the yeshiva. So I have not, personally, I've been living through our rabbis in the field, but Abby was very correct in shaking me out of that and saying, Dov, you yourself personally have to get out of your bubble and have to also be doing this.
Beautiful. So last question, then we're going to open up for y'all's questions. Just they stay on this theme of post October 7th. It's such a game changer that I honestly can't remember how I thought before.
Yeah.
It feels like I'm so immersed in this last over a year. And, that old joke religiously that anyone to my left is a heretic and to my right's a fundamentalist, right? I think in this Israeli political discourse, I oftentimes find myself thinking someone to the left of where I am, oh, you just hate Jews in Israel. And anyone to the right of mine, oh, you're like a warmongering hawk, it's like, okay, no, there's like a whole lot of different views on this stuff. And I wonder, like, how might this book, this conversation have looked different post October 7th, in this whole different world that we're in of understanding that we've never been before in my lifetime and your lifetimes.
Yeah. Okay. So, I think that it would have been a lot more difficult, because what makes the book special, and by the way, I do want to say, just in terms of the book, it's only about 4 to 5 pages each parsha. So it is the easiest book to read. You buy it, yes, and each week on Shabbos, just read 4 or 5 pages, and you'll be done with it through the course of the month. And also,
it's very affordable.
and one of
and you don't have to go to shul at all.
And one of the things that makes it special is it's not just here's an idea on the parsha. It's the dialogue and the conversation, and people who read it feel that they really are being brought into that conversation and are part of that conversation. So that's just in terms of the book. But as far as this point that you say, it would have been so much harder, because as you say, it's a minefield right now. I mean, part of what was exciting about the book was that we could explore issues and say, how would the Torah speak about this? And what does it make us think differently about the George Floyd or about the pandemic? And we weren't afraid that if we said something that wasn't the party line, people were going to start, telling us that we're either anti-Zionists or that we're, as you said, warmongers. And here it feels like we can't have a good, honest dialogue about what's going on now. If somebody wants to talk about concern for Palestinian life, it's like, oh, so you're the enemy, right? Like, can't we talk about things without having to pick sides and everybody being absolute? So it would have been very difficult, because we would have had to either not talk about what's going on or be walking through a minefield. That being said, I do want to just share one insight that I have relevant to what's going on, which is, when the Israelites are crossing the sea, they burst out in song. It's the passage, Az Yashir Moshe. It's a whole section in the Torah about the song that they sing when they're crossing the sea. And then the Midrash, though, is a bizarre Midrash. It says the angels wanted to burst out in song, and God said, my handiwork is drowning. How can you be singing? But the Israelites were singing. And what it shows us is, based on our vantage point, we are going to have radically different reactions. And I sometimes feel that when Americans talk about the war and is Israel acting correctly, not acting correctly, and so on, like, we have no concept about what that looks like from the perspective of the Israelis, you know, who are still in trauma from October 7th, whose children are in the army, whose husbands are in the army. Every day is under the weight of what is going on. They have still not recovered. So we just have to accept, like, we might be in this position, this luxury position of the angels, you know, they are in the position of the trauma. And I think we have to appreciate the gulf.
Very nice. Wow.
And I will just say, because Dov shared it, he lost a nephew 7 months ago, 8 months ago in Gaza, who was serving, 20 years old,
22.
22. And so it's very real for him. And I agree that I don't know that we could have done this book, honestly. I will just say, it sounds like a cliche to say we've got to be talking about these things, but I am moving through a lot of Jewish patients, not just at Central, but whether I go to an AJC thing or an APAC thing, or you know, name your Jewish organization, your ABCs, and it's just a conversation that is untouchable. And that to me is a personal loss, and it's a Jewish loss. I do feel like, Rosh Shmuly, you would help us find that language in a way that you have to sort of be someone who has enough bona fides. I just interviewed Tal Becker, some of you may know, he defended Israel in The Hague, and I interviewed him 2 days ago in San Francisco, and he can go there because people know where he is, and his kind of credentials are so unimpeachable. And he can talk about the fact, as he does, that actually compassion is not just for our souls, it's also strategically smart if we want to, you know, have a safe Israel. But just in most spaces, I feel like it's kind of like what Dov says, is who's talking here, and what right do you have to even have an opinion? And I do think the Torah could be a roadmap, but as soon as you're talking about celebrating the death of our enemies or Amalek, and we saw what happened with Amalek. I mean, you know, again, something that I used to think was so completely ancient and remote. You know, what's Amalek? Is suddenly, you know, is Smotrich just talking about Amalek, and that's part of the justification for why they have their ethnic cleansing as a goal, because he invoked Amalek. So our Torah is also been weaponized even now in a way that obviously I bemoan, but it makes me feel like I wish in some of our communities, in safe spaces, I'm so tired of that term, but that we could actually go there with Torah as our guide.
Beautiful. So friends, we have about 15 minutes left. We want to open up the conversation. And yes, if you'll raise your hands and I will come around to you, I will make sure for Zoom to repeat the question. Let's start with Rabbi.
Thanks. Moving to a more ancient conversation than post-October 7th, I'm interested to hear each of your perspectives on the verse that condemns male homosexuality as a capital offense and an abomination, and how do you approach that?
I'm gonna let Dov handle that.
Okay, great. So the question was, since they explore Parsha together, how they both interpret the prohibition against, sorry?
Handle it, yeah.
Oh yeah, how handle the prohibition of homosexual sex. And methodologically, how do you think about that? Not just what your answer is to it, but how do you read the text?
You want to like summarize?
Yeah, well, the verse in Leviticus says, with a male, you, and the you in the text is a man, with a male, you shall not sleep as you sleep with a woman. That's the verse in Exodus. And that has been understood rabbinically to refer to anal intercourse between two men. And I wanted to start by saying that, like, this is, I would say, the absolute biggest challenge that Orthodoxy is dealing with these days. If 20 years ago, people would have said it's the women's issue within Orthodoxy, not like we've solved that issue at all, but it's, you know, but
Women's leadership,
women in the synagogue, women's equality, you know, and they're 50% of the community. But the degree of, first of all, we become much more sensitive to the issue, much more aware of the homosexual, you know, about this is an identity, and the sensitivities have shifted so radically just in my lifetime in the last 20 years. But also the degree of exclusion is that the sense of not being wanted, of not being recognized for who you are as a full human being, to be able to have a partner, to share your life with somebody. You know, this is so many gay people feel that they do not have a home in the Orthodox Orthodox community and have rejected not only Orthodoxy, but Judaism in general. This is definitely the most urgent issue within the Orthodox community. And, what we are trying to do, our yeshiva that really is trying to be responsive to this, is certainly out in the field. I mean, I will say that, it's our rabbis out there who are working to actively create synagogues that are fully welcoming to LGBTQ individuals. And we actually recently had a sort of a rabbinic retreat bring together rabbis across the US to try to talk about how do we continue to move the ball forward here. So I own the great urgency and importance of this issue. At the end of the day, it is probably going back to Abby's point about trying to reconcile the text as good. I have no answer. If you look at how the commentators explain what the prohibition is about, it makes sense if you assume that everybody is heterosexual. Assuming everybody's heterosexual, then you shouldn't be having adventurous sex with men. You should be having sex with your wife and get married and have kids. But it doesn't work if you recognize, that the world is not all heterosexual. And I really have no explanation. And I just see my role now as rabbi is not as grappling with that, with the theological question, but with doing everything I can at the practical level. Maybe I'll use that to share a teaching of Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik said, why is it that Rav Joseph Soloveitchik was like the towering figure of modern Orthodoxy of the last generation? He said, why is it that Jews have not dealt with the question of theodicy, like in an intensive way? It's very much a focus of the Christian community. Why do bad things happen to good people? And it's somewhat dealt with in the Jewish tradition, but we really don't focus on it. And he said, because if you focus on coming up with an answer to that question, then it means that at some level you've made your peace with the fact that bad things are happening to good people. And as Jews, he said, we can never make our peace with bad things that are happening in the world, with human suffering. We can never make our peace with that. So I don't want to have an answer to how can this be just. I want to leave that as a problem. It is not just. And I don't know, ultimately, I'm not, what the explanation is, but I want to figure out what we can do on the ground to make it better.
Yes. Thank you. Another question. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the presentation tonight. About 15 years ago, we had under Rabbi Kleinberg, who was here before Shmuly, we had a panel of rabbis who spoke. And 15 years in Jewish life is like 80 years in any other life. So 15 years ago, we had a highly respected Orthodox rabbi. We had a highly respected female Reform rabbi. We had some other rabbis in there. The female rabbi and the Orthodox rabbi were sitting next to each other on the panel. Conversation got a little heated, but the conversation went on. The female rabbi said, "Rabbi, why can't we just learn Torah together?" And he didn't have an answer for her. Now, fast forward to now, we can't even sit down with each other and talk. So my question is there any hope to get this conversation expanded beyond where we are?
Great. So just for the Zoom folks here, I think many of us know who Stan's referring to. There was an Orthodox rabbi who had been here for many decades, and a Reform rabbi who who was loved here, who moved away a few years ago, and they were on a panel together. And they said, why can't we just learn like this more often? And as Abby said earlier, the mainstream stance in Orthodoxy is you can't be on a panel with non-Orthodox rabbis, that you will be validating them. That is the mainstream view. And so is there any hope, is there any optimism to actually break through that? Like there's such a brokenness when we can't just learn Torah together, talk together about issues. Like, was the question hope in the end, or how do we get there?
Yeah, how do we get there?
How do we get there? Okay, who wants to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think for all of our pessimism, there are so many, bright points of light, 1,000 points of light, whatever, to invoke George Bush. But truly, I find this just in my journalism pursuits is that there, even though that happened, where I described that on the JTS panel stage, there are many more moments where I see the cross-pollination happening. And I think that particularly post October 7th, there is, despite the fact that we've managed to still splinter ourselves, there is a sense that if not us who, like we are such a tiny people, we have to sort of find ways to connect and stay together. And, you know, I certainly find that there are things that I've seen that I thought I would never see. I would just say very quickly that I did the New York Magazine piece on the ordination of Sarah Horowitz back in 2011. And the vitriol was so extreme that I thought this is just never gonna fly. I mean, it was like, you know, again, that they had killed people, you know, that the idea that Avi Weiss had decided to ordain a woman in Orthodoxy was destroying Judaism. And just, you know, 15 years later, they're all over the country. I mean, you know, that's no small thing. Similarly, the YCT rabbis, you know, from my vantage point, they're as rigorous and as Orthodox as it gets. But I understand that the way the RCA feels about YCT, but there hasn't been the same kind of, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. We haven't been attacked lately. So I just feel like this is itching. I remember it was Sarah Horowitz who said, let's just put facts on the ground. And I feel like that's what's beginning to happen. There are just more facts on the ground that move the needle.
So I will say that a similar question was asked. Abby and I actually did a presentation at Chovevei Torah at my rabbinical school, and also the Maharat joined us as well. And a similar question was asked, like, how do we get this type of dialogue happening more? And Abigail, tell me if I'm quoting you correctly, but Abby's response, I think, was, it's all of you that are going to do it. The types of rabbis, you know, that are coming out of Chovevei and Maharat representing a different type of an orthodoxy that values this. That's why we're here. That's what we're trying to do. The other thing that I will say is, I think one of the things this dialogue benefits from is that even though it's framed as Orthodox rabbi reform journalist, it's not, you know, there have been like books before, an Orthodox, Reform, conservative take on the Bible. 3 rabbis talk and bring their, you know, different takes. But they're speaking as representing a denomination. Nobody is representing anything here. I mean, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, but I'm representing myself. I'm talking about my take on it. Abby is representing herself. And because of that, we can be more open and honest. We don't have to feel like we're defending something and representing something. And I don't know how we get there, but I think that's often what stands in the way, that everybody sees themselves as a symbol and as representing.
Great. We have a question here from Rabbi.
Just building on the last question, I'm curious if there is a boundary or someone that might call themselves Jewish that you would refuse to sit next to on a panel, or that you would refuse to learn Torah with. I'm thinking in my head about Jews for Jesus, Lubavitch Messianism, and other groups, but I'm curious where those boundaries might be for you or not.
Okay, for our Zoom friends, we're talking tonight about the value of pluralism to some degree, and Jews learning together. But what are the boundaries of who we should learn with, and who we should not? And Rabbi Green's 2 examples were both on the theological front. Jews for Jesus, or what was the other one? Lubavitch? Lubavitch Messianism. Yeah, someone who thinks the Lubavitcher Rebbe is Mashiach and is going to have a second coming. Yeah, it could also be a political extreme. Yeah, so it could be on the far right side, Ben Gvir Smotrich. It could be on the far left side, an anti fill in the blank and anti-Zionist or stronger. So yeah, so would you put some boundaries on who you would learn?
So I think I would distinguish between being on a public panel and having a Torah conversation, because, you know, I don't think that it's never it's double negative. It is sometimes the case that actually being on a panel, depending on the context and depending on what people are looking for, you know, can give some recognition, validation, et cetera, that you don't want to be giving and the other person is seeking. Yeah, I can't answer it in the abstract, but I will definitely say, yes, there would be times where I would actually say, do they want me on this panel as a way of saying, oh, you see, we have an Orthodox rabbi and that means X, Y, and Z? I think the problem is that Orthodox rabbis are always thinking that that's what people want, and they're always projecting that, and they're, you know, and they've made it a policy. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't ever happen. So in terms of like talking Torah, I think my question would be, is this going to be a worthwhile conversation for me? Like, if it's not public, right? Like if this person is just going to be spouting their gospel or trying to convince me of something, like what am I getting out of the conversation, right? But if it's really open, honest, curious exchange, if I think that that's the type of exchange we have, I'm happy to talk to whoever.
No, I would just say, thank you, Rabbi. I would just say that as a journalist, I sort of have the cover of being a reporter. And so that has helped me be in certain spaces and have certain conversations that I don't have to betray what I actually think of them.
Okay, that's awesome. Okay, our last question here from our friend, who worked here.
Thank you for coming to Arizona. For the sake of this question, I'll just kind of split myself into a dichotomy, and I would like your advice. Abby, to the reform side of me, who, let's say I'm spiteful towards my Orthodox self, what would you say to that side who looks at the Orthodox as, looking down on my queer friends and putting up a mechitza and not shaking hands with my mom? And Dov, what would you say to my Orthodox side who is looking at the reform and saying they're diluting Torah, they're changing God's eternal commandments for our people and trying to sort of twist what we are as Jews? I would just like your advice there.
Okay, from our friends on Zoom.
Good question.
My dear friend Mason, this is very real. I mean, he learned at Yeshivat Torah, he's learned at Orthodox yeshivas, and he works in a Reformed temple, and he is, I mean this in the most beautiful sense, a complicated Jew, right? He's got a lot of different flavors in him, a lot of questions and ideas, and that's a wonderful thing. And he feels the voices talking to each other inside of him, even putting the other side down to some degree. And how would you respond to that kind of agitation with that other side, pulling them just to one end? Was that a fair? Is that a fair? Okay.
What's your name? Mason. I mean, I just love that question because you're calling out something so true that often people just don't put out there as honestly. And that to me is half the battle of this. I mean, that sounds like a cop-out, but I really think that sometimes just starting with what our judgments are, it would just be so refreshing rather than just letting them inform the ways we're shutting down and siloing each other. I do feel like so much has been lost in the Jewish community because we're constantly policing each other or judging each other or deciding someone's Jewish enough or not Jewish enough. And yes, as a Reformed Jew or as someone who belongs to a Reformed synagogue, I know how many say I'm a bad Jew because of X, and I'm weary of it. But I also judge those who don't learn. Like I'm listening to these folks over here who are wonderful benefactors, who I just feel like that's my Judaism, is the constant inquiry, is just being, and so those who say, I'm done, I'm Jewish enough, I know what I do on my Seder, and I know I show up for my holidays, and I don't need, even our book, which I think is so, wonderful. Just the idea of like, really, you won't even, whether it's my book or something, or our book or another, like you're baked, you're finished. So I judge that. Like even I see myself that I judge non-learners. So we're all doing it. And it's just I'm not just affirming you, I'm saying I think that so much, we could get so much further by saying, okay, right, like in this room, how are you judging right now? Because it would just, I think, dilute and force us to look at like what a waste of time that is. And now let's get to the Torah discussion.
I will note you didn't answer the question. Artfully avoided having to defend all of those negatives of Orthodoxy. So what I'll answer the question directed to me. I'll say that similar to, I think, the discussion before about Moses and was he still living in the past? I think so much of that attitude, look at how Reform Judaism is diluting and corrupting and all of that. Like, it's living in the past. It's living at the time when, Reform was breaking away from Orthodoxy, or was a threat, and it was attracting Jews away from the Orthodox community. So a lot of Orthodox rabbis were said, they're a danger, and we have to put up big walls, and we can't sit on panels with them. Look at what they're doing to hurt the Jewish community. where whatever truth there was to that 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right now we're all in the same business. Okay, the business is connecting Jews to Judaism, keeping Jews as part of the Jewish community, engaged, growing, learning, and to me, that would be my basic answer. You know, it's not your Judaism, whatever, but right now, if you look on the ground, what are, you know, Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative synagogues doing? They are keeping people connected and growing in their Judaism, and that's my message.
Friends, let's hear for Rabbi Linzer and Abby Pogrebin. This has been such a delightful exploration of relationships and values and Torah and learning and truth and so much more. I hope you'll keep the conversation going with them when they can sign a book for you at the dessert. We've got some mousse and some drinks and some fruit. I want to thank again Temple Solel for hosting us, our wonderful friends, the Hammermans, for making this possible tonight. My dear friends, Carrie and Isaac and Alex and all of you who are here on Zoom as well. Oh, I'm seeing your beautiful smiles right there, blowing kisses. And we hope you'll continue to learn with us and bring your friends who agree with you and disagree with you into our learning community as well. Have a great night.